Greetings from Michigan State University, and welcome to EAB University's 2018 Spring Webinar Series, which is funded by the USDA Forest Service. This is Robin Usborne, and along with my EAB University colleagues, Cliff Sadoff and Elizabeth Barnes from Purdue University, and Amy Stone from Ohio State University, we welcome you to today's webinar, which is Determining Impacts on Wildlife from Emerald Ash Borer Infestations of Black Ash Forests, presented by Dr. Alexis Grinde. Alexis is a wildlife ecologist at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. Her research focuses on conservation ecology of birds and studies the impacts of environmental change on wildlife and biodiversity. Applications of her research include providing recommendations for conservation plans for species of conservation concern. Before we get started, please know that we welcome your comments and questions, so please feel free to type them in the chat feature, which you can find by mousing over the bottom or occasionally the top of your screen. We will be making note of all the questions, and we'll have Alexis respond to them when her presentation is finished. To keep these free webinars coming, we do need your feedback. After the webinar, you will be emailed a link to a short, voluntary, confidential survey that I hope you will take the time to fill out. If you're one of the first 10 people to fill out the survey, we will be sending you an EAB goodie bag. For those of you wanting CEUs, if you would like a certificate indicating that you participated in today's live webinar, complete the survey and send an email message to Amy Stone at stone.91@osu.edu. You will also receive instructions in the email how to do this. Certificates will be emailed to you within a week of today's program. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing soon at www.emeraldashborer.info on the EAB University page. You will also find the recordings for all previous EAB University webinars there. So thank you for attending today, and Alexis, feel free to start your presentation.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be talking about this today. We are sort of in the middle of our project, but I'll give you some preliminary results and just sort of be talking about the general impacts that we think we'll be seeing specifically in Minnesota regarding emerald ash borer and their impacts on wildlife. So I am a wildlife ecologist, and I work at the Natural Resources Research Institute, which is an applied research organization with the University of Minnesota Duluth. And the sort of overall mission of NRI is to look at ways to ecologically, economically, and socially sustain our natural resources. And so we work in the bird and wildlife ecology lab. About 90% of our research is really focused on birds. So, and we do all these different research projects to really develop conservation strategies and also inform land managers for how to conserve these species that might be in need, but just overall biodiversity as well. And so that's sort of one of our projects that we're working on is regarding EAB and wildlife. So a little bit of background on the emerald ash borer. It is a wood-boring beetle that's native to Asia. It was likely introduced to the United States via cargo ships or planes. It was first detected in Michigan in 2002, although it was probably here at least a decade before that. We're just not in high enough levels to really be detected. The emerald ash borer attacks native ash that are greater than 1 inch in diameter. And unfortunately, because this is a non-native species or an invasive species, our native ash trees really have little resistance built up to the emerald ash borer. So it's about 99% mortality for trees that are exposed to emerald ash borer. It takes about 2 to 3 years for the tree to die, usually after it's been infected with the emerald ash borer. The larvae that are actually what's in the tree eat the inside of the tree so that it disrupts the ability for the tree to move its water and nutrients. And so a lot of times you'll see the die-off first at the top of the tree and sort of work its way down. Functionally, the tree is starving to death because the larvae are interrupting its ability to feed itself. We have no biological control in the United States because, again, it's a non-native insect. And then we're sort of trying to come up with these silvicultural control prescriptions, but have been largely unsuccessful so far. Here's the map that I downloaded from your website, and all the dark green are states that have confirmed presence of EAB, and the lighter green states are ones that are looking but it has not been detected at this point. But because these states actually have native ash, it's expected that in probably 5 to 10 years, the invasion will continue to spread westward. So the life cycle of the emerald ash borer is that the female will come along and lay about 40 to 70 eggs in the bark of an ash tree. And really they can lay eggs in any ash tree, any species of ash, and those eggs will then sort of burrow into, or will hatch and then burrow into the wood of the tree. And again, this is sort of where they eat and disrupt the phloem and xylem so that the water and the nutrients can't be transported. Those larvae will stick around there for 1 to 2 years and then finally pupate into adulthood. One of the key things that you can look for to see if an ash tree is infected with emerald ash borer is this sort of D-shaped hole that shows the exit point of the adult emerald ash borer. So 1 to 2 years, again, depending on when the eggs actually hatched and how much they were able to eat and survive, the adult will hatch out and fly off to a new ash tree, and the whole cycle will start again. In Minnesota, we have really cold winters, and there's some evidence to suggest that in the northern parts of the state, those cold winters might kill off some of the larvae. But our winters are getting warmer and warmer, and so it probably won't be a saving grace for sure. So some people hope, but I think it might be maybe a futile hope in our state. So as of August 2017, EAB occurs in 31 states and then also Ontario and Quebec. Again, like I said, it kills 99% of the ash trees in its path just because of our ash trees don't have natural resistance to this invasive pest. So this has led a lot of agencies to develop quarantines and fines. So we really are limiting the movement of ash from the infested areas. So this has big effects on our economy. Overall, in this part of the North America, it has cost hundreds of millions of dollars to municipalities, private property owners, and also the forest products industry to deal with ash and try and limit the emerald ash borer infestation. Again, we're going to talk about Minnesota, but this here is the Twin Cities, for those of you that aren't familiar, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we've had, this is where we've had emerald ash borer for quite a few years, and it's been spreading down to the southern parts of the state via these riparian corridors. This is where I'm based, right here, right on the shores of Lake Superior in Duluth. And it's just been a few years since we detected emerald ash borer, but we'll be seeing, we expect to be seeing it spreading throughout the state here in the next few years. So the response to emerald ash borer has been really focused on controlling EAB. And unfortunately, this has been largely ineffective, which is why we see this like pretty consistent spreading from Detroit, where it was first detected in 2002. A lot of the targets of management efforts have been in urban areas because there are a lot of ash trees in urban settings, along the berms and people's yards. In Minneapolis, we have about a total of, I think, 60,000 trees, ash trees. And once they found that EAB was in Minneapolis, they had a target to remove 5,000 of those ash trees every year. So it's a pretty big effect on what we call the urban forest. There's a lot of bird species, pollinator species that depend on urban forests, people's yards, for stopover during migration, but also actually their breeding activities. The loss of these mature trees from the urban canopy will probably impact a lot of birds specifically that are commonly found in people's towns and in towns and people's yards. And they're not being replaced by any mature trees. It's going to take 20 years to sort of restore that urban forest with the mature trees. So that's an issue. We're not focusing on the urban environment at this point. We're focusing more on the actual forested ecosystem. And there hasn't been a ton of management that's done preemptively in forest ecosystems to sort of see what we can do to adaptively manage ash stands in forests to see if we can mitigate the effects of EAB. And so a lot of our forest industries in Minnesota, sort of learning from what's happened in Michigan and Wisconsin, have started to think about, can they plant replacement species for black ash? Can we cut down and do big harvests of ash before EAB comes along? And how are these things going to affect the overall forest ecosystem? So again, here's a map of emerald ash borer status in Minnesota. Quite a bit of loss of ash already in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And then again, this is a riparian area down the southern part of the state where there's been a lot of ash mortality already as well. Again, here I am in Duluth. The EAB was just detected here maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but we're expecting that EAB will spread all throughout this forested region of the state. And so in Minnesota, from here down to sort of right about there is really densely forested, and a lot of natural ash are found in that forest ecosystem. We have 3 different species of ash that are found in Minnesota in high abundance, but together it's about 1 billion ash trees. This is a map showing just the density of urban ash trees throughout the state. Most of that is green ash. We have the white ash that's being impacted down in the southern part of the state. And then the large majority of ash in the forested region of the state is black ash. Black ash occurs in what we call black ash wetlands or forested wetlands. And they sort of occur as these little pockets of low-lying areas mixed in with these upland kind of forest areas. And it's these black ash forests that we're focusing on for my study. So the black ash wetlands, again, cover about 1 million acres in Minnesota. The wetland characteristics are that they have poorly drained soils, but the black ash trees serve as a foundational species, and they strongly regulate ecosystem processes. Specifically, they sort of regulate the hydrology of the system. So again, these are sort of low-lying areas, and so water will pool up in these places, but the black ash will suck up that water, and so we have these wet periods after the snow melts, but by maybe July, a lot of the wetlands will actually have dried up, and it'll go back to more of a drier ecosystem. Because of the really unique ecology and physiology of black ash, there's no obvious replacement, or there's nothing we can go out and try and cut down the ash trees and replant something else that will serve the same function as black ash do in our forested wetlands. So the loss of these trees, especially in large quantities, are going to have potentially significant impacts on our hydrology. Again, in Minnesota, these black ash wetlands sort of are part of the watershed, and so how the hydrology changes will affect everything in the watershed and potentially water quality as well. But also that change in water will change the vegetation availability and habitat that's available for wildlife. So there's not a lot of information that's known about the direct impacts of EAB and wildlife. And one of the things that we do know, and that's actually used to help manage EAB and detect EAB, is that woodpeckers love EAB larvae. So woodpeckers, it's their ecosystem niche to eat wood-boring insects and larvae. And woodpeckers have figured out that EAB is delicious and have used it especially as a food resource in the winter. In the urban settings down in the Twin Cities in Minnesota and probably other places in the United States, they're using woodpeckers as indicators to look for EAB-infected trees. And so you can do this by actually saying, oh, there's a lot of pileatids in my yard, I have a lot of ash trees, I bet there's some emerald ash borer infections that are going on. You can target, hey, let's cut down these trees and get rid of them because they are infected with EAB. And this, the woodpeckers can detect these larvae before the tree even is showing any sign of dieback or pre-symptomatic. And so it's really allowed for focus management in urban settings. And we're trying to think if there's ways we can develop ways to look for it in forest settings, but it's sort of harder to go out and look at millions of acres and see about woodpecker density. But we're trying to come up with some mechanisms to use that to inform focus management strategies as well. The study that was published on woodpeckers and EAB was published in 2013, and it was focused on what happened in Michigan after the initial infestation of EAB. They used bird feeder watch data and people's backyard sort of data that they had collected, or citizen science data, to look at, how did the woodpecker populations change after we know EAB was detected just west of Detroit. What they figured out is that at that time period from 2002 to 2011, when EAB was really abundant and widespread in that area, we had a big increase in this species is called the red-bellied woodpecker and white-breasted nuthatch, and that was probably in direct response to increased food availability. And there was also a positive response to two other woodpecker species, downy woodpeckers and hairy woodpeckers. But these guys didn't have such an obvious response over time. They first declined, and then they fluctuated over time and showed sort of annual increases in that area compared to areas nearby that didn't have that EAB infection. So what this tells us is that woodpeckers are smart and they'll eat whatever is available. They don't care if it's non-native. They were able to utilize a new food resource. But the ability for them to really regulate the amount of EAB or the spread of EAB over space and time, it was limited. They didn't probably do anything really effective to stop the spread of those insects. One of the other studies that have been published on the effects of what you want to call wildlife and EAB was looking at ground beetle communities in Wisconsin, and it looked at the effect of loss of canopy and the change of temperature associated with the soil and the drying of the soil. And it showed that there were definitely changes that were happening at that ground beetle community. But really, that's about it. When we developed this project, there wasn't a ton of other information out there about, well, what exactly is going to happen to wildlife if EAB continues to spread through Minnesota in these really rich forested areas, and what can we do about it, if anything? So what we know from what's happened in other states that have experienced EAB infestation is that, we have a typical black ash stand, EAB comes along, the ash dies off, and it changes to what we call emergent wetland or herbaceous wetland. And again, the black ash stands regulate hydrology, and so these things dry out over time, whereas these emergent wetlands will stay wet for the majority of the year and just freeze over and then thaw and stay wet for the majority of the year. And so you can just see visually that's different habitat that's available for wildlife. We wanted to look at a wide variety of taxa, mammals, birds, and amphibians to see, as this shift happens, what effects will there really be, and how will these changes actually impact the overall diversity in Minnesota's forests, if at all. So the thing that's really unique about our black ash wetlands is that they are uneven age stands. And so a lot of forests in Minnesota are managed as even age stands where sort of all the trees are at the same canopy height. But black ash wetlands, just because the water's soggy, the soil's sort of soggy, there's a lot of water, these trees will fall over, we'll open up the canopy, we can get new regeneration, and so there's a lot of young and older trees sort of mixed in these wetlands. That uneven aged characteristic allows the stands to have this really high diversity and complexity in both the composition of the understory and structures that are really important for a lot of wildlife. The other thing that's important about black ash in Minnesota is that they're found in these sort of little pockets surrounded by upland habitat, and they can range from anywhere from like 10 acres to much wider or larger complexes that span the landscape a couple hundred acres. But it's really sort of this network of black ash stands that aren't necessarily connected, but provide this sort of unique habitat in the middle of more homogeneous habitat that make the black ash wetlands really interesting. So what, again, we kind of know about black ash wetlands is that the young ash trees are delicious for deer and moose, and so they will be used pretty much right in line with what's available for them to eat. And then also the mature trees provide cavities that are important for denning, roosting, nesting for some mammal and bird species as well. All right, so that's kind of what we know. That's the status. And so now I'll talk about the preliminary results of our data that we have so far collected in Minnesota. The title of our project is Determine the Impacts of Wildlife from Emerald Ash-Borne Infection of Black Ash Forests. It's funded by a state funding agency called the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources. It started in July 2016. And we did our first round of full wildlife surveys this past summer, and we'll be starting our second round of wildlife surveys here in a couple of weeks. We have several partners on this project from around the country. Dr. Rob Slezak works with the Minnesota Forest Resource Council, and Dr. Brian Pollock works with the U.S. Forestry Service Northern Research Station, and Dr. Anthony D'Amato works at the University of Vermont. And they've been doing research looking at black ash, hydrology, soil characteristics, silvicultural techniques for a while in Minnesota. And so we've partnered with them so we could use their foundational knowledge and apply it to what we're seeing with wildlife. So our study is again focused in northern Minnesota, where we find most of our black ash. We have two different components to this study. On the map here, the red dots are what we call our experimental sites. And you can see a sort of a close-up of those experimental sites on this picture here. There are 8 different sites with 4 treatments in each site, so 32 experimental sort of places that we go. Each site has these 4 treatments that simulate different stages of EAB infection or management techniques to maybe address the EAB situation. So the first is our control site, and this is where we retained all ash, so it's just what they currently look like, the current environment of black ash right now. Then they girdled all of the black ash trees in the second treatment, and that simulates the EAB mortality, where basically we're having a die-off from the crown down of the black ash trees, and so that's been sort of changing over time. The group harvest selection was something that they had set up to look at what would happen if we go out and preemptively remove black ash from the landscape in these 0.1 acres or 20% of the unit. How will that change the hydrology and the function of these black ash stands? And then the clear cut is, okay, if land managers go in and just say, well, let's get rid of all the ash, it's going to die anyway, we'll send it to market, here's what's going to happen. But also the clear cut represents the future, potential future of our black ash stands after EAB mortality has occurred. And so we focus a lot in these experimental stands on these two, because these are really the contrasting things, the current conditions and the potential future conditions. And what we're trying to do is quantify the differences in wildlife using these sites compared to these sites in these experimental stands. We can then use that data to sort of predict what might happen to black ash stands on a wider or broader landscape. So we're also looking at all these yellow dots are 29 additional black ash sites that are distributed across northern Minnesota. And these sites, again, are really the dominant canopy species is black ash. And they have these characteristic structural diversity and compositional diversity, different hydro periods, so they stay wet for different times. But we really try to get the whole gradient of what black ash stands sort of are in Minnesota. We'll use the information that we get from the experimental sites to say, okay, well, here's sort of what generally black ash communities look like, and here's what they might look like in the future based on what information we're getting from the clear cuts. And we can also have sort of this middle of the ground option. If we do this management, here's what happens, and here's what we expect to see in the short term once EAB gets to these forested regions. So the reported changes that occur in EAB infested stands are that the trees will die and we'll have increased ponding. And so those are sort of the big broad things that we're looking at. And we figured that those events will affect different taxa of wildlife in different ways. And so we do surveys basically year-round in these stands to look at all the different taxa. In the fall, we focus on small mammal trapping, and we use live traps, these Sherman traps, where we bait them and we put in water and stuff, and we get small mammals that go in there. We tag their ears, and we're looking for how many small mammals are living in these black ash stands, along with what are the densities, what's the species composition, that sort of thing. In the winter, we're using two different types of technology to sort of figure out what's using these stands at that time of year. We use something called digital audio recorders, which are basically just a recorder, an audio recorder that we stick out attached to a tree, and it's set or it's programmed to record for a couple of hours every day. And with that, we're looking for maybe owls that are using the stands, woodpeckers that might be using the stands in the winter, and other resident bird species like chickadees, ravens that we have in Minnesota. We also have camera traps set out in the black ash stands. The camera traps are baited with chicken and like salmon oil, and we have these sort of set in the middle of these experimental stands, and they're set to take a series of pictures every time it detects motion. And so here's a nice picture of a gray wolf that we got from our camera. So there we can see what's actually moving through the stand. Is there any differences in what is willing to move through a stand in the forested or the control sites compared to the clear cut or open sites? That's kind of data that we're getting in the winter. In the spring, we continue to use the digital audio recorders and the camera traps, but we also have field observers out there that are doing call surveys for amphibians and also early breeding bird call surveys. And really, again, for Minnesota, it's some owls, woodpeckers, and a couple of game species, ruffed grouse and American woodcock, that might use these black ash stands too. In the summer, we continue our amphibian surveys, but here we're looking for larval egg masses that are going to be in the wet areas, the ponded areas of the stand, and we'll see if we can figure out how many tadpoles are hatching, that sort of thing. And then we're also doing getting a lot of data on the breeding birds that are nesting in the black ash stands. And most of those are migratory birds that come from Central and South America, breed in Minnesota, and then will leave come August, September. So our preliminary results, and again, this is preliminary, so maybe next year when we have our final results, these might change, but I'll come back then and talk to you guys about our final results. But here's what we're seeing for each of the taxa. For the amphibians, here we're focusing on the current conditions, which are these black ash wetlands, and comparing it to future potential conditions, these emergent wetlands. We only have about 6 species of amphibians that are found in Minnesota. There are some salamanders, but they're in really low densities and really hard to detect. So it's these 6 species that we can get enough data to really say anything about. What we saw our first year is that these 6 species, so these species down here correlate with these guys here, all the 6 species were found in lower proportions, lower densities in the black ash stands compared to the emergent wetland stands. So just at first glance, hey, losing black ash might be really important for or might be good for amphibians if you're an amphibian type of a person. One thing that we're also looking at is the landscape context of our black ash stands. So these amphibians, they breed and then they lay their eggs in these little ponded areas, in these wet areas. Of course, the eggs then develop into tadpoles, and the tadpoles metamorphosize, and then they leave as juveniles and disperse into the surrounding forested habitat. And so we're looking at the landscape context to see if that really matters for it being emergent or black ash. So that's kind of the bigger picture. It's more of the life cycle of the amphibian, not just the breeding cycle. So that's where I think we might see some importance for black ash compared to the emergent wetlands, is that landscape piece. But we'll see what the spring brings. The reason that the emergent wetlands are probably a little bit more beneficial to these species are that that open canopy increases the water temperatures. Increased water temperatures lead to increased algal productivity, which means more food and more, the faster the larval amphibians can grow. Additionally, like I said, the black ash sort of sucks up the water and decreases the hydro period in the forested wetlands. But when we get rid of the black ash, the water just kind of sits in pools, and so it's more of a long-term wetland. And so these species can use it more or for longer periods during the breeding season. Overall, those increases in ponding, the increased temperatures, may increase the species richness and abundance for amphibians in the wetlands. Additionally, these egg masses and the juvenile recruitment or the survival of tadpoles might increase because, again, there's more water there. Long-term, a more sort of sustainable water resource for these guys, so they can metamorphosize before they leave the pond. So our preliminary results are suggesting that the loss of ash could actually increase frog diversity and biomass of the amphibians in these systems. Unfortunately, that's probably the only taxa that would really benefit from the current or from predicted changes. Our breeding bird surveys suggest that black ash stands as they are really important for many breeding bird species. So with the breeding bird surveys, we're really looking at the forested wetlands compared to upland forested habitat. And what we wanted to see is, well, the majority of Minnesota is this upland forested habitat, so aspen stands. And again, there's sort of these little pockets of black ash stands that are embedded in these upland habitats. Minnesota has incredible bird diversity. It's one of the most diverse areas in all of North America for breeding birds. And what we really wanted to see is, do these black ash stands provide any really unique habitats? Are we seeing unique communities, or is it pretty similar to just, all the other upland habitat that we have? So we sort of have these paired design to compare bird communities in the lowland, the wetland areas compared to the upland areas. And our preliminary data from last year showed that the number of observations, the number of species, and the diversity for forest-dependent birds was higher in black ash forest stands compared to the nearby upland forests. The birds that are using the black ash stands are really birds that are commonly associated with older growth forests, or at least mature forests. And those are sort of diminishing from the landscape, not just in Minnesota, but kind of everywhere, and are found in smaller and smaller pockets. Some of those bird species are things like the brown creeper, the northern parula, and winter wren. And then we also see bird species like the chestnut-sided warbler and American redstart that like to have these sort of open gaps in the canopy. We're also using these black ash stands. So it's a really unique assemblage of bird species that we actually don't see in many places, in all the places that we survey in Minnesota. The reason that we can get this combination, this unique combination of species is, like I said before, probably linked to the unique diversity of the understory, the complex canopy structure associated with an uneven aged forest. And then just all the cavities and the down trees provide really unique microhabitats that are beneficial for many different breeding bird species. So we think, and again, we'll see what this year brings, we think that it's those really unique habitat characteristics that increase the abundant species richness and diversity in the black ash stands compared to the upland forests. We use the digital audio recorders, these remote sort of things that just record automatically over time. And so we had them set up in the spring, the winter and the spring and the summer. I guess we have them pretty much year round. But one of the interesting pieces that we got from our spring data was that there was a bunch of migrating birds that stopped over and used black ash wetlands. So they were migrating through, they weren't breeding there, but they just stopped over because it looked like a nice place to rest and maybe get some food. One of the most important species that we recorded was something called the rusty blackbird. The rusty blackbird is one of North America's most rapidly declining bird species. Here's a population chart. It's really, really declining. It doesn't breed in Minnesota except for maybe in the very northern parts of the boundary waters. It just goes through Minnesota on its way to Canada where it breeds. There's a lot of factors that are contributing to its population decline. There's a lot of conservation efforts to conserve this species. But losing important stopover habitat along its one of its primary migration routes might, of course, negatively impact its population as well. And the loss of black ash tan might also reduce the availability of critical habitat for many migrating birds that we've been recording. So overall, I was honestly a little bit surprised at the big differences in bird community abundance and diversity in black ash stands compared to the upland stands. I went out and did surveys this June, and I was really surprised at how many species there were, how many different species there were. It was sort of like this magical little spot for birds. And so when we got our preliminary data back, we were like, wow, this might be really an important thing to start thinking about a little bit more. Birds throughout the eastern and western forests have experienced forest habitat loss and changes to the forests that have impacted biodiversity. But one of the biggest things that I think the birds are facing are how are they going to deal with climate change and the changes to the forests that are associated with climate change. There's a recent study that came out just last year that suggested that diverse old growth forests that contain a lot of different trees, different sizes and different canopy heights might buffer the effects of warming for some wildlife species. And so since black ash stands are really unique in the way that they are, this mixed age stands, it might actually, the loss of those from the landscape might exacerbate some of the impacts of climate change already that they are experiencing. We think it's important for managers to think about, even if we lose black ash, how can we keep these forested ecosystems, the structure intact or somehow simulated on the landscape? And so that's one of the things we're thinking about as well. And our last focal taxa are mammals. So the small mammals, again, we trap for these guys in the fall, and we get a lot of different species. This is a flying squirrel right there, which is awesome. But here we're going back and we're comparing current black ash stands to emergent wetlands and sort of seeing what those small mammal communities might change into. The small mammal species, there is definitely a changeover in the clear cuts, which are the blue lines here, where there's quite a bit fewer of our most common species in the clear cuts compared to the other still forested treatments. But we're actually seeing that the small mammals prefer the girdled, so EAB mortality, and group selection, or so the managed ones for the Peromyscus or mouse species and our bull species. But we just don't have enough information at this point to really make any clear conclusions about what's happening with small mammals. but we expect a changeover in small mammal community. We're not sure about abundance or diversity quite yet, but we'll know by next fall. And then lastly, our camera trap results. These guys are out in the winter and through the spring. Again, they're both baited, and here we have the camera traps set up in control black ash stands, and then also in emergent wetland stands or clear-cut stands. And so they're both baited. The same sort of techniques are used in each one. But what we see is that almost all of the species that we detected were more commonly detected in the control or the forested wetland compared to the clear-cut or the open emergent wetland, with the exception of the ermine. If you want to check out our camera trap pictures, which are really cool, this is the website, that you can go to. I could send that out too if anybody's interested. So the summary of the mammals is that the camera trap surveys documented 12 different mammal species, and all of which, except for the ermine, were significantly more likely to use the forested black ash stands compared to the clear-cut. So that difference was really pronounced for forest-dependent species such as the American marten and fisher. So even though these experimental areas are pretty small in terms of acreage, and it's a relatively small area, forest-dependent species were really reluctant to go through these open areas. We were a little bit surprised by that too, just because it's such a small, like, sort of pocket of open areas. But now we're thinking that the loss of black ash might have really important implications for forest connectivity and further exacerbate the impacts of habitat loss and forest development for a lot of these forest-dependent species. But again, we'll be collecting more data. We'll be excited to see what happened over this past winter when we go pick up the camera traps, and we'll see if we continue to see the same trends. So in summary, the loss of black ash over small spatial scales seems to result in turnover of wildlife communities from forest-dependent species to more open canopy or wetland-associated species. The overall impacts on biodiversity may be minimal, so we might still have the same number of species. It's just going to change over which species are there. And even in the case of amphibians, the loss of black ash may be potentially beneficial, and we might see an increase in biomass of the amphibians. However, for the forested wildlife, there may be really significant impacts, both in terms of life cycle needs or importance of black ash, so for migratory species, breeding bird species, but then also mammals that have larger home ranges that might avoid these little pocketed open areas. We, based on our new data, we're working with a lot of forest managers to help develop adaptive forest management that focus on planting replacement tree species, because we think that's going to be really important for maintaining our forest-associated wildlife. And we want those tree species to be able to provide the same compositional and structural complexity in these ecosystems that the wildlife seem to really be responding to. So that is all I have for today. Our funding acknowledgements, again, are from the Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund, or LCCMR. We work on the Chippewa National Forest and also the Superior National Forest to do a lot of our wetland surveys. This is our crew that's out there battling all the bugs all the time, collecting all the data. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Alexis. This has actually been quite fascinating. I don't think I remember that we have ever had a webinar that dealt with wildlife and the impacts of EAB on, or possible impacts of EAB ever. So it's like, oh, there's a whole other thing to look at, because we've all kind of been thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to the ash, species? What are people going to, do about trees? And it's kind of been more human focused. But this is really great. I'm going to ask that you send me that link with the camera, with your
Sure.
camera results, because then I can put that in that email that I send to everybody. So, okay, with that, let's see. There's some questions. Is there studies in other states like this, or plans for such?
Not that I know of. And in fact, when we started developing this project, I was sort of really surprised that there hadn't been any. But I think it had happened so quickly in Michigan and Wisconsin that really the focus was on seeing what you could do to limit the spread and sort of saving the trees where appropriate and sort of avoiding the large loss of ash. And so now we're just to the point where we were able to set up this experimental study design. We know it's coming and sort of start looking at this preemptively. And so I don't think there are any other studies in any other states that have been able to do this before and sort of predict in the future piece.
All right. I'm not sure that you can answer this or would be the person to answer this, but it says, what other tree species are being looked at to replace black ash?
Yeah, there are a bunch. So the partners that I work with that set up those experimental sites, Rob Slezak, Tony D'Amato, and Brian Pollock are the guys that are really looking at those replacement species and trying to figure out what will work there. And I don't know off the top of my head, I'm going to say yellow birch, but I do have that information. I just don't know it right now.
Okay, that's fine. But thank you for that answer. I guess I don't know I have not heard about that going on. So what is replacing black ash? Are there other questions? Okay, it says, any thoughts about impacts of ash on bats? Yeah,
so we actually have at the Natural Resources Research Institute, we have another lab group that's focusing on bats, and not just in black ash stands, but just bats around the state in general. And just because they're in these little pockets, they don't seem to be using black ash in high abundance, but they definitely do. Bats aren't really necessarily particular in what tree species they use. They're more just looking for that structure, like sort of the bark peeling off for the roosting sites, that kind of thing. And so we have been looking for signs of bat dens, roosting areas while we're out there, but we haven't really seen any. But in general, I think it's the same sort of thing where these black ash stands, they're older, they're mixed, they have a lot of like den cavity areas that bats might really like. And so just losing them from the landscape, again, we're talking about 1 million acres, it can't be good for the bats. So that's kind of where we're at, that we're there, but we don't actually have any data at this point to say anything really specific beyond that.
All right. Jessica Harshorn has shared a PowerPoint link that Brian Pollock that is talking about the replacement of black ash.
I was actually just scrolling on my other computer trying to find that too.
Okay, so we've got that. Any other questions here? While we've got Alexis as a captive, a captive speaker here. Okay, does EAB attack any other trees in your study? Any other diseases out there?
So EAB is, yes, specific to ash, and in our study area, it's really the black ash that's in the highest abundance, but there is the green ash that we have in a lot of the parks and the riparian areas in Minnesota, but nothing outside of the ash. But we do have a lot of other forest pests that we're sort of looking at as well. We have a native forest insect called eastern larch beetle, or ELB, that's attacking a lot of our tamarack, and we're seeing really similar responses to wildlife in that regard, where tamarack is also sort of a foundational species, but it's a conifer species. It controls hydrology. When the tamarack dies off, these stands that were forest, like a wet forest, turn to an emergent wetland, and so then that forested area is lost. And so EAB itself isn't doing anything else besides ash stands, but there are a lot of other forest pests that are causing similar issues. And one of the issues with ELB, while all of a sudden it's native and being a problem, is because of climate change, it's able to survive the winters and have more larvae and eggs during the summers. So.
Yes, climate change is affecting us all here.
Yes.
So, okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, but I will, in my email to you all, I will make sure that I put Alexis's email address in case you have questions after we're done with the meeting and that you'd like to direct to her. And I'd like to thank you, Alexis. This has been pretty fascinating. I'm eager to see what you find and what you report at the end of your research. So we will have to get in touch with you again and have you report that when it's all over. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I appreciate it again, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We will have one more EAB University session next week, and it is on wood usage. And I want to tell everyone, have a great day. Thank you for being here.